Good morning. May I have your attention, please? Thank you so much. We are going to start today with a very exciting and already a kind of traditional session called China and the West. And this is, I think, one of the high points, although they are all high throughout the Israel Political Forum. But this one, I think, is started to grow more intensive and more interesting and more challenging as the years went by. China and the West is really a very, very important issue, maybe one of the pressing issues of the contemporary world. And it's not only the topic that attracts such a crowd and such an exclusive crowd, but also the speakers who are really the world-class specialists on these matters of China and relationship of China and the West. But before I begin a couple of presentations, let me just say that I'm very pleased to host this session, very honored to do so, and I'd like to thank João Carlos Espada and his incredible team for this organization, which is already summing a considerable number of issues, all very successful and all growing throughout the years. So this is something that I think Católica is very proud about, and I hope that you are going, all of you, to have a wonderful day and a wonderful week throughout this seminar or this political forum. But our session today is missing one of the discussants, as you may have noticed, John Owen, because of difficulties in transportation and the chaotic situation of airports throughout the world. It's not only a Portuguese situation, unfortunately, it is spreading, and he could not make it, but we are going to spread somewhat we are going to use all the time that we have, obviously, for the presentation and discussion, and extending a little bit of time that the audience is going to have to ask questions and to listen to the answers of our wonderful speakers. But this session is going to be chaired by José Pena do Amaral, also a traditional participant in China and the West, a very well-known specialist in these issues as well. And José Pena do Amaral is going to introduce the speakers and tell you a little bit more about the organics of the session that we are going to follow through until 11:15. Let me say that João Carlos Espada is very keen on keeping a very tight schedule, so we are not going to go beyond the deadline that he has set for us. So without further ado, José, please have the floor.
Thank you. Not sure that this is working. It is working. So good morning. It's my privilege to introduce the host, because the host hasn't introduced herself, which is normal. So Luisa is also a traditional member of this panel. I may speak like this because we are getting the same team as last year for this same topic, with some changes. And Luisa Leal Faria is a full professor at the Faculty of Human Sciences at the Catholic University of Lisbon, where she has been Vice Rector for 8 years, and so it's for me a pleasure to have you here. And so we are going to organize our session mostly in the same way that you saw yesterday. We will have a speaker that will present his views for about 20 minutes, then the discussants will have 10 minutes to comment. We'll take some questions from the audience and a final round of comments from the panel. So it's my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Xiao Qiang, who has been with us last year by video. Now we have them live, and it's a very nice opportunity to hear you. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Professor Carlos Espada, and your colleagues, and everyone here. It's actually a last-minute call that I was preparing to be a discussant, and now I'm the speaker. and I don't have a paper. What should I do? Also, I really want to talk about Ukraine. But our panel is called China and the West. So how about this? Let me contribute a perspective, a China perspective. Let me put it this way. Let's do a practice. I'm the China, you are the West. The Chinese ambassador is now here, right? He won't approve. But I set up myself a standard. I do better job than the Chinese ambassador. And I'll start what the Chinese ambassador always do about President Xi Jinping and his speech. Well, actually, let me give you my qualification for that. It's not in my bio on the program. I was born in China, 1961. I remembered the China's Cultural Revolution between 1966 to 1976. Any of you can Google what a Cultural Revolution is. But for every Chinese who living through that period, darkest period of Chinese history, I cannot draw a comparison. If you really, really have to draw, maybe Nazi Germany or today's North Korea. I entered China's elite University of Science and Technology, studied physics between 1979 to 1986, including the bachelor degree and a master degree. I came to US in 1986, doing a PhD program in astrophysics, and came back to China in Beijing in June 1989, wants to be part of the student protest movement after the Tiananmen massacre. And that was my last time in China. So 33 years has passed. The rest of it is in my bio in the program. Okay. Let me start from Xi Jinping's speech. Which one? Oh, I forgot one important personal note of my qualification. Between 1978 to 1979, I was 17 years old, high school student in Beijing. Just happened to be, I was living with my great-uncle family. Upstairs, my apartment, now I know, was today President Xi Jinping. He was 10 years old, about 10 years old older than me. He was newly married with the last marriage. He always quarreled with his wife. As a matter of fact, his wife always shouted at him, ex-wife. And each of our families has a bicycle place. I have a bicycle, I go to the high school, I came back and park my bicycle. Somehow his bicycle always took my position. Now I come back to his speech. This speech he made is at a ceremony marking the 100 years anniversary of Chinese Communist Party on July 1st, 2021. 5,222 words. I'm not going to read it for you. But I'm going to interpret. I'm going to pick up few phrases from his speech, and I'll explain it to you, what he's trying to say. The first one, obviously, is Chinese Communist Party. So, China and the West. Communism is not exactly China, right? It came from the West. But Chinese Communist Party is also very Chinese. I'll explain that. The second phrase I'm going to pick up from his speech, in Chinese, it's called 中华5000年文明. The official translation of that is the Chinese nation has fostered a splendid civilization over more than 5,000 years of history. Chinese traditional culture. That's another thing he touched upon. The third thing I want to explain to you is in his speech. He didn't put it in the very prominent places, but in other speeches he gave, he put it in very prominent places. It's about diplomacy. He used the expression called the once-in-a-century changes taking place in the world. The once-in-a-century changes taking place in the world. And I'm just going to unpack it right now. What does he mean? He means that West is declining and the East is ascending. Or even sometimes they say US is declining as a power and China is ascending. He also means, when this is once in a century opportunity changes, he also means a technology factor. Science and technology change the fate of a nation. That's what he said. He also implies and means, which I'll come down later, that autocracy has a systematic advantage this time. And he also means China, his China, Chinese Communist Party's China, going to play a long game with the West. Two more phrases from his speeches, 5,000-word speeches. Another is the great rejuvenization of the Chinese nation. You heard this all the time if you are Chinese. You turn on the Chinese TV, you have a Chinese person, that's all over the place. And finally, building a human community with a shared future. That's his vision to the entire world. He used a phrase called building a human community with a shared future. And these English translations are from the official Chinese state translation. I didn't give a touch. But I'll give some of my explanation. Chinese Communist Party, I'm not going to say too much, but because of his speech, I'll just say a few words. Using his word, starting from 1921, the Chinese people and Chinese nation was going through a great awakening and Marxism, Leninism, and that came from Russia. That's Xi Jinping's original speech. I'm not going to say more other than say China's still a one-party dictatorship, Leninist party, and the rest of it I'll touch upon. Well, let me say one more. This dictatorship, the Chinese Communist Party dictatorship, is relentless, it's determined, it's unforgiving, and sophisticated. This dictatorship, under President Xi Jinping, is only growing harder and harder within the setting of economic progress. Now, let's talk about his other phrase, talking about Chinese traditional culture. And this one, as a Chinese, I'll tell you something. Everyone look at the Chinese culture. You look at Confucianism, and then you look at the harmony, order, hierarchy, 5,000 years, this and that. And Chinese government sending the Confucian school all over the world to say, promoting Confucianism. But for any serious Chinese historian, they will tell you that's not the reality of Chinese history. In the Chinese history, for more than 2,000 years, I wouldn't go far, 5,000 years, but starting from the Qin dynasty, there always, particularly politically, if you look at it, there's a word for it called 儒表法理. It's called Confucian legalism entity to describe the political system. What is it? If I translate it very plainly in my own words, it's called Confucianism is what you say you do. Legalism is what you really do. And what is legalism? Legalism is just another school of Chinese thought that every ruler, every dynasty follows. Confucianism is what they tell their officers, they talk to their people, they train them thinking that way, ideologically control them that way. But legalism is what we really do. What is legalism? It's authoritarian, almost very often totalitarian. It's rule by law or rule of men by will. Or, put it that way, it's the ruler is enemy with people. That's the real thought of the Chinese ruler. I'll give you a list of things starting from 2,000 years ago, is still going on in China today. Household registration system, legalism. The implication system, one person crime, whole family, whole village implicated, starting from Qin Dynasty. Strict control of people and migration. Enriching the country and strengthening the army. And there's a saying, legalism. All land belong to the king. All men are servants of the king in the kingdom. Cunning diplomacy through bribery and propaganda. And a world empire. That's legalism. 2,000 years ago, continues every dynasty. It's not a secret. It just, they don't tell you if Chinese ambassador is sitting here. The next one, the once in 100 years change. And I want to emphasize one thing, technology factor. Or I want to call today, China is a growing surveillance state. Google it, surveillance state. Look at the New York Times' latest report in the last week. What's going on in China now with the technology? And let me use another Xi Jinping's quote. Big data should be used as an engine to power the innovative development of public security work and a new growth point for nurturing combat capacities. I'm not going to go long lengths to describe the advance of the digital technologies in China in the past 20 years. I've been following it. It's pervasive, it's sophisticated, in some aspects very advanced. In many areas, it's a truly competitor with the United States and Europe. Actually, Europe doesn't even come close at the area of AI, but China does. But I'm talking about the political control aspect of it. I'm talking about controlling the internet for public opinion, censorship, propaganda, disinformation. I'm talking about social credit system, giving every Chinese citizen a number of credit. You can promote them if they do something government like you to do. You can downgrade them if they do something government doesn't like you to do. And now, with the pandemic, there's a new thing, health code. Chinese citizens willingly putting their personal information in that app, in their smartphone. Every one of them, over 100 million in China. And recently, they just locked down the entire city of Shanghai, 24 million people for 2 months. By that code, without that app, you cannot go out your apartment, you cannot go out of your room in your apartment building. It's that effective. And what is it? It's an app can identify your location, your health situation, even sometimes your social network. It's a sophisticating surveillance, violate privacy. It's an automatic, systematic description and prejudice and a political repression. It's also productive, to organize the people, what Foucault called biopower, control the population, make them productive. But this type of control, China goes to really extreme. It's not that technology is so advanced. Western countries can have it too. But with the privacy protection, with other rule of law, you can't just go that far to do this. But China can. China can tapping into nationwide reservoirs of data. China can operate with opacity and impunity, the state. Often people didn't know that they're being watched. And Chinese authorities require no warrant or collect personal information. But if they do know, well, then technology it also has a Pentagon effect. The surveillance itself will inhibit unrest and crime. And also the technology has encoded power imbalances. Some of those documents we reviewed shows there's a red list of people that saying the surveillance application cannot use them, must ignore. Not everybody. Now, given the time, I'm going to go quick. I'm going to go to my next point. What is China's model for this digital civilization, this technology factor? Well, what I call the digital-driven behavior conditioning happening in today's world. It's transforming every society. But Chinese Communist Party's design for the social order is based on the vision that human nature compatible with both Leninist principle, remember Chinese Communist Party, and the digital age, the technology factor. The human beings being understood as a herd creatures, requiring guidance and steering. Under the guidance of a wise, strong, great herdsman, the herd can be formed into a productive and technologically innovative society. That is China's vision. Where does it go? The system of herd control, not just about control pandemics. It's about maintaining and sustaining perpetual dictatorship of Chinese Communist Party. So I even don't want to use the word autocracy or authoritarianism. I'm going to throw the word totalitarianism right here. Yesterday, Professor Platter was describing totalitarianism, being used to differentiate it from authoritarianism. Totalitarianism was used to describe Nazi or Soviet Union or Mao's China. But today, China, by this speed, is totally on its way towards what I call a digital totalitarian society. Again, you can study what is totalitarianism. There's ideology, there's a leader, there is everything in the state, nothing against the state, nothing out of the state. Oh, wait a minute. That's Italian intellectual on Mussolini's fascism. Is that relevant? It does. Since I'm in Europe, let's talk about fascism and to see if it applies to today's China. One party, single party dictatorship, I already said. Together, anti-union, anti-labor stance, Chinese economy today, does it look like in the 1920s Mussolini's corporatist fascism? Xi Jinping used nationalism, traditional culture, 5,000 years Chinese civilization. Doesn't sound familiar if you look at history, what Hitler and Mussolini said and did. That kind of enthusiasm about the traditional culture, that rhetoric, also stresses the country, this time it's China's, historical role. They're entitled, there's a historical entitlement to superpower status, to rule the world. And finally, this is old fascism didn't have. The 21st century technology has provided the Chinese Communist Party surveillance capacities that facial recognition, big data, artificial intelligence, even quantum computing, And the state, with coordination with its technology giants, control and tracks messages and content shared between every smartphone in China. And everyone have it. No, not everyone. Elder people don't have it. Really poor people don't have it. But they do not count in a digital totalitarian Chinese society. They don't have a voice. They don't even exist. Like this time you can see in the Shanghai pandemic. I'm going to move fast. I think I've done most of my job to interpret President Xi Jinping's speech. And now come to the last part, which is, what is he called building the common future human community? Well, I wouldn't call that. I will call that is the rise of a Chinese digital nationalism, digital totalitarianism. I would call that is a call for the great digital contest between the two political systems, two set of political values. Let me put it this way. I even don't want to use the word competitor. I want to use the word rivalry, systematic rivalry, to describe the relationship. And I want to emphasize the competing battlefield is at not only just the digital technology, the cutting edge technology itself, is application to the society about what human deserves and what human's nature being acknowledged and what's being suppressed and where this go. Let me finish my talking to say this. I'll say China is already the richest, most powerful, and technologically most advanced dictatorship. Use surveillance, censorship, manipulation of information. The Chinese Communist Party shored up its power at home while weakening democratic competitors abroad. That's the relation between China and the world. The rise and global expansion of this Chinese digital totalitarianism is reshaping the balance of power between China and the West. The rise of a totalitarian China is the most significant international threat that Western democracy, and actually global democracy generally, now faces. And this will be true for the rest of this century. And that's what I call the great digital context. And it's not an overstatement to say the future of humanity depends on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Qiuqiang, for your so stimulating insights. And I'll give the word immediately to my fellow James Carafano.
Thank you. Was it on? No?
I think it's...
No? Yeah, oh, there we go. So I want to talk about the most important thing, and then if there's any time left, I'll comment on the paper and China. You cannot have a conference at Estral without multiple references to James Bond. So, no, you can't. So everybody knows, the association and with the hotel, and I don't know what you think of where Her Majesty's Secret Service fits in the canon of James Bond films. But what I have to tell you is the most important and significant film ever was the original Casino Royale in the 1960s. After they got the rights to the film, they realized that the entire book had been cannibalized in other James Bond films, so all they really had was the title to Casino Royale. So they hired 3 separate directors to make 3 separate parts of the film, and they told them not to talk to each other. So the result is they put together this completely incomprehensible film, which I really think explains the West's response to China. It's a perfect analogy. But the only thing they have in common is they did want the good guys to win at the end. So I think it's a perfect metaphor for the conference and for today. I thought that, thank you, Professor. First of all, you are much better looking in person, I must say that. So what I want to offer up is I think, as opposed to maybe when we started this conversation years ago, I think we can actually begin with the premise that China is a global geostrategic challenge. I mean, we can debate the nature and everything else, but I don't really think that's up for dispute in the free world. So what I want to offer very briefly is a way to measure if we're actually taking it seriously. And so I just outlined a couple of things, and I would say when we come back next year or the year after, if we're making progress on these things, it reflects that we do care about our own freedom and prosperity and security and the China challenge, and we're doing something about it. And if we don't, then it's just a nice conference with nice weather and grilled fish. The first one's maybe the most controversial, which is climate. I mean, I think we have to be honest. There is a real tension between a notable desire for a rapid transition to renewable fuels and zero carbon emissions by 2050. And there's a tension, but there's a real tension between that and the goal of reliable, affordable, dependable energy that isn't dependent on your enemies, whether it's Russian oil and gas and nuclear or Chinese solar panels and batteries made by slave labor. If we cannot resolve those competing goals in a way that looks after our economic and our security interests, in addition to being good stewards of the environment, then we're not really serious about the China challenge or the Russia challenge, which we'll discuss in the next panel. The other one I think to watch for is what I call inter-theater cooperation. And that is literally the nations in the Indo-Pacific, not just caring about the presence and influence and actions of China in the Indo-Pacific, but caring about what's going on in the transatlantic community. And conversely, the transatlantic community caring and engaging in the concerns of our key allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. If that happens, I think that's a reflection of again, a joint response. If it doesn't, I think it's a reflection of the inability to deal with that. So what does that look like? Well, demonstrably, even as we're getting ready for the Madrid summit, it does not mean NATO in the Pacific. I think that's a nonsense idea. I think it's completely unrealistic, and it's also not going to happen. NATO needs to focus on the defense and the security of the NATO region. And I think the reality is that is going to be NATO's focus. And there's very little as a collective organization that NATO can do in the Indo-Pacific. Even the notion of a China-NATO dialogue, I think, is complete and utter nonsense. The Chinese don't do mill-to-mill dialogues the way we do in the West. And it doesn't produce trust and confidence at all. And there's no natural partner for NATO in the Pacific. I think if there is cooperation, it's going to be led at the bilateral level. We're already seeing some of that. So for example, with increasing frequency, you see Taiwan and South Korea and Japan and India in Europe trying to understand the European situation, looking at joint issues. We see increasingly, for example, France and the UK and other countries increasingly present in the Indo-Pacific. And I think bilateral cooperation is what will lead the way. And if we see that to continue to evolve and develop, and then that's a sign that we're dealing with. And it's going to be across the spectrum of activities. Professor talked a lot about technology. I think that's clearly one. Supply chains, energy. I think all the fields of economic and diplomatic and political endeavors. The next one is international organizations. And the comments I would make today are different than the comments I would have made last time we met, which is the Chinese have been systematically and seriously, with every serious international multi-organization that they can get into, trying to not just put in Chinese officials and employees, but to shape those policies so they're constructive and positive for the Chinese Communist Party. That is a conscious and deliberate strategy. It's not about international norms. It's not about rules of the road. It's about how we can use these organizations to shape better outcomes for China. I think that people were largely oblivious to that a few years ago. I think that's begun to change. And I think that's another area where I would look really consciously at and see, are countries being more focused on dealing with the corruption and abuse and manipulation of international organizations by China and other malicious powers. And so, famously, we all debate the World Health Organization, but there have been significant issues, for example, with Interpol, where authoritarian countries have tried to harness Interpol to chase down political opponents and dissidents. That, to me, is a really prime area of research and focus and attention. The next one's military investments. It's very, very clear that China is intentionally and consciously, in a way it hasn't done in previous decades, building up both an expeditionary military capability So that means a military not just to govern and control the Chinese people, but a military that can be deployed and actually use with coercive measures in other parts of the world, and not just Taiwan, but as far-flung as far distant theaters. And they're also building up their strategic deterrent capability in a very, very serious way. That is a military challenge to not just protect Chinese interests, but really to challenge other nations in other parts of the world in their physical control over peoples and places. I think, incredibly aggressive. And the question is will countries match that? The taming of China will not be because of a rules-based order. It will be because China is militarily deterred. And that means both adequate conventional and strategic capability to match what the Chinese are doing. And I think, for the U.S. and for the West, it's even more complicated because it's not just about China, it's also about Russia. And I would argue to some degree Iran as well. So we've seen this commitment in recent months in Western Europe, for example, to significantly increase conventional defense forces. That has to sustain over time. This is a very long-term competition, and the Chinese pay attention to what we do, not what we say. We can say all kinds of things about collective defense, but they're going to look just not at our current defense expenditures, but they're also going to look at the out years, as well as what kind of systems, capabilities, manpowers, and force structures we are fielding. That will impact their behavior much more than the NATO long-term whatever doctrine. And the last one is maybe the most difficult and the most interesting, and I think the one most fascinating to watch, and that is security cooperation. And I mean security cooperation, particularly at the seams, in places where there is very low possibility that an entity or a nation could be integrated into a formal defense structure. So, for example, we could debate Ukraine. I think the likelihood of Ukraine joining NATO anytime soon is very low. But, for example, in Western Europe, it's not just Ukraine. I mean, there are lots of buttons that Putin can push. Moldova, Georgia, the Balkans. None of these areas are likely to be easily integrated into a security architecture, but their ability to provide for their self-defense and security, as well as their economic and good political governance, are a form of stability. In Asia, most famously, we have Taiwan, but there will be others as well. And so how we choose to do that, and the degree that we're willing to do that, and how we shape that will be very much significant in sending a signal to the Chinese on how willing we are to compete for our own security. And I'll just finish on this just very quickly. Look, I don't actually like the term the West. I think it's kind of pejorative and imperialistic. I like the term free world, and I reject people that say, oh, I don't want to be part of the free world. And like, dude, if you want your country to be free and independent, and you share the notions then by definition you are part of the free world, however you choose to exercise that right and responsibility. But what really binds us, I mean, fundamentally, for the discussion about authoritarianism, we believe in three things. We believe in human rights. We believe in freely elected governments. And we believe in the free enterprise system. China doesn't believe in any of those things. And in fact, China sees those three specific things as obstacles to the expansion of its power and influence. And regardless of how we defend the Chinese, if we don't stand up and defend our own equities, the Chinese will seek to take them away from us. And I think I just offer this list as this will be a sign, not if we're serious about taking on China, but if we're serious on protecting the things that allow for there to be something in the world called the free world. Thanks.
Thank you very much, James. Well, the debate is building up, and it will go on like that, I'm sure, with the intervention of Martin Aller. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on this panel, and happy to be back here. It's a beautiful place, and it's a very well-run conference. I think I will pick up where Professor Xiaochang left off. I think he gave a very good description of some of the basics of the political system in the People's Republic of China, and I will try now to put it in the international context, because the topic of this panel is China and the West, which really should be China and the world, I think, in my opinion. Anyhow, to do that, I have actually prepared two slides, two pictures. I don't believe in PowerPoint, but I thought that 2 slides is something that everybody can take in. So can I have the first one, please? Both slides are maps, visualizations of the voting patterns in the Human Rights Council in Geneva in the last few years. This is something that the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung is doing regularly to visualize the voting patterns there. And it's actually very interesting. So this is the latest vote that took place in the Human Rights Council in Geneva at the beginning of the current 50th session of the Council. And there were 2 competing joint statements. And the joint statements are presented not just by the members of the Council, but any country can join. That's why we have so many countries on both sides of the divide. And there were 2 competing joint statements presented at the beginning of this session of the Human Rights Council. One criticizing the human rights situation in China, and the other one defending it and blaming the West for hypocrisy and things like that. So I think the map sort of speaks for itself. The interesting part is, of course, the white spots, those countries that didn't join either of these 2 initiatives. There are some, as you can see, there are some interesting examples, for instance, in Europe, where some EU countries didn't join, and then there's a number of white spots in the Global South. Now, to put this map into perspective, we would probably have to look at the whole pattern of voting at the Human Rights Council over the last few years. Certainly over the last 2 years, there's been a number of similar situations ever since the introduction of the state security law in Hong Kong. I think there was the first case where we had these competing resolutions and joint statements. We cannot go through all of them because there's so many of them, but the second slide, if I can have that one, please. The second slide shows the pattern of voting on China-related resolutions in the last year, during 2021. Here, the structure of the map is slightly different. So the white spots, this is only the voting countries, only the members of the Human Rights Council. So the white spots, the countries in white, are those that are not members of the Human Rights Council. And the different shades of red or brown are the percentage of voting with the People's Republic of China in the Human Rights Council. So, in general, we can see that the pattern is somewhat similar. We can see, a huge divide, but it's a bit more nuanced because, particularly in the Global South, we can see some countries sort of in the middle of the debate, voting with China some of the times, but not always. Countries like India, Indonesia, the Philippines, and some others. Now, if we can go back to the first slide again, please, and maybe just leave it hanging in the background, because I think this map really shows very well what the point I'm trying to make. So, from these maps, from the voting pattern in the Human Rights Council, we can see that basically the world seems to be dividing again into 2 large blocks. These maps, of course, show that on the basis of attitude towards human rights, but in my mind, that's actually a crucial question. Human rights, of course, always have been important, but during the old Cold War, the Soviet bloc was basically trying to ignore them or to negate the debate. But here, today, we have a different situation when the People's Republic of China is essentially trying to redefine human rights. So they're going on their own offensive instead of defending themselves against the criticism coming from the West, to present their own philosophical or probably more accurately political vision for human rights. And the main feature of this vision for human rights into the future in the Chinese rendition is basically state-driven right to development that takes preference over what we normally understand to be the basic human rights that are based on individuals. So, again, when you look at this map, you can see that there's a surprising number of countries that are subscribing to this vision, right? At least statistically based on the vote in the Human Rights Council. It's there's been some talk lately about the recurrence of the, and actually I think we talked about this the last time here in SalaAtl, about the recurrence of the Cold War or the return to the Cold War. Now, myself, I would probably be more careful with these terms. You don't enter the same river twice, and there are as many differences as there are similarities with the with the original Cold War, not least the 30 years of very vibrant globalization that lie in between and that made the world so much more interconnected. But I think it's safe to say that we're basically reverting to a two-block situation in a different environment, in a different international setting. And now the international environment differs in many ways, but I think one of the substantial features, of course, is that the theater of the confrontation is moving geographically to the east. That might be somewhat counterintuitive, given what's going on in the Ukraine right now. But I would argue that the main flashpoints for potential confrontation into the future between the two emerging blocs would be in East Asia. Now, and that's very interesting because the current alliance architecture in the world actually reflects mostly the situation after the end of the Second World War and the end of the Cold War. So the major international institutions that have been upholding the existing order are based on the Euro-Atlantic alliance, basically, in military terms, it would be mainly NATO. And we don't have any similar institutions, organizational framework that would organize security in Asia. There's, the organizations that do exist in Asia, either traditionally or those that have been forming in the last 2-3 years, like the Quad and AUKUS, usually only cover a subsection of the whole region. And in this context, I think it's very interesting. The very interesting thing is the emerging concept of Indo-Pacific. I think we should probably be talking about it a little bit more here, because I understand the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific, the People's Republic of China, Beijing, has been complaining that this is an attempt to create an Asian NATO. We have heard that that doesn't really make much sense. It's not very likely for a NATO-like organization to come up in Asia in a geographic region that is much more diverse and much more complex. So it will never be a NATO, but it might very well be an equivalent of the Euro-Atlantic community, or at least that's, I think, the aspiration. That's the intent for the Indo-Pacific, the underlying intent to create sort of a system of collective defense for the values that the free world, or whatever you call it, believe in. And in this sense, I think the Indo-Pacific could well become an equivalent notion to the Euro-Atlantic. So, in other words, I hope that into the future we will have more discussions about the concept, because I think it's, in many respects, still quite misunderstood, especially here in Europe, despite the fact that most European countries now have their own Indo-Pacific strategies, and the European Union itself has its own strategy. But I think there are some substantial differences between the different understandings of the concept. And I think I'll end right here, because I think I'm over the time already. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'll take 2 questions. Let's say 3. But if they are concise, I think I can take 3. I didn't see who was first. This gentleman here. It was in front of me, probably because of that, but I don't know. Yeah, there are 2 gentlemen here, and another one. Well, I can't make. Please.
This question is directed to Mr. Carafano. I think it was very useful that you laid out benchmarks, to judge progress. Let me ask you for some specifics on 2 points, which are connected. First of all, the issue of technological competition with China and the role of what I'll call flat-footedly industrial policy by the United States and other Western nations in order to bolster our technological competition. Second benchmark, do we now have the military force structure in the Indo-Pacific that we need? And if not, what do we need to add to or reorient in the current US-led military coalition in that region in order to achieve the deterrence that we need?
Thank you very much. Second question here.
Hello, my question is about linking kind of this topic of China versus the West and Russia versus the West, and it's primarily addressed to Xiao, I guess. So for Russia, it has been always very important to find some kind of ideological allies within the West as kind of disruptors of the West. And for Soviet Union, it was kind of Western left. And for Putin's Russia, it's more kind of nativist, anti-globalist right. What about China? Does Chinese regime look for any ideological allies within the West? Or is ideology at all so important for China, or it's just strong China idea, which is kind of more central? Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I'll take a geographical criteria, one from the left, one from the right. It's 4 questions, and I can't take any more. Sorry. So I think I see a hand there.
Young man right here.
And another one there. So you choose. I'm sorry, I can't control who was the first, so.
Okay, thank you. I want to I just asked Chao to respond to something. It was very interesting personal history. You didn't mention that you're also the founder of Human Rights in China. And that sort of leads to the question, as somebody who was born in China, who lived in the same house with Xi Jinping, that was very interesting. Is there any hope? In other words, you were there in 1989, Tiananmen Square, but you've presented a picture of a country that is not only forever authoritarian, but is going to get worse. How does somebody in your position, think about whether China can change? I don't want to ask you how does China change, but can China change, or is it just going to be permanently this kind of a country?
So another one from that side. There is a hand. It's you? Okay, thank you. You have the microphone, so you have the power.
Well, it's a question open for the panel, but we can agree that Xi Jinping is in some way more ambitious and more ambitious and simultaneously more cautious than Putin in the way he expresses and uses his power. Just as we saw in Ukraine, with Putin, trying to demystify this idea that President Obama presented in 2015, that Russia is no longer more than a regional power. Beijing leaves, as Professor Yang said, with a feeling that time and history are in its side, and with a far more superior economy than the Russian, and the influence that is simply not available for them. President Xi is after a radically transformed world order.
It's only one question, sorry.
No. In the economic expand, China is already trying to push the US out of the Pacific because it's majorly the one spot the one economic spot in the world. And talking militarily, when we're addressing, for example, Taiwan, and the Biden administration has already addressed this, will the West have to respond militarily in the case China invades Taiwan, or will we see another wave of sanctions, for example, in this case to the debatably biggest economy in the world, which would have massive countermeasures?
Thank you very much. All the others that would like to raise questions can meet the speakers in the garden. It's very much pleasant. And during the coffee break, I'm sorry, I have to keep up to schedule. And so I'll give 5 minutes to each of our discussants and key speaker. I'll start by Martin. I'll ask you to keep up to these 5 minutes. I'm sorry, I didn't.
Actually, I will only take 3 minutes, and I would maybe, because I expect the other speakers to address the other issues, maybe I'll just say a few words about ideology. I think ideology is of an utmost importance to China domestically. So we see a renewed emphasis on ideology with the coming in of the current Secretary General Xi Jinping. Internationally, it's not so important for China, and I think the People's Republic of China really only wants other countries to subscribe to some of the basic notions. Well, first of all, they want other countries not to oppose their their talking points in international organizations, things like that. But then there are two aspects, two notions that are of much meaning to the PRC internationally, and two points that they're basically trying to redefine in the international discourse, and that's exactly human rights. There's one of them, and the other one is development. And that's why I actually thought that this the maps of the voting patterns in the HRC, in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, are so telling and so important, because when you think about it, the Chinese view of human rights as basically a state-driven right to development goes to the very basic, to the axiomatic notions of politics in general. They're basically trying to redefine or reinterpret the relationship between the individual, the society, and the state. And that's exactly where I think the dividing line, ideologically, politically, and otherwise, lies between China and not the West, but China and the rest, I would say. Thanks.
Thank you.
Right. I'll be quick. Nobody can talk faster than me because I'm a New Yorker, and nobody talks faster than a New Yorker, so probably give you a minute back. Hey, to answer your specific questions, I think there's a zero chance we're going to get an integrated Western industrial policy. In the best case, we'll have things like, in the case of a specific issue like 5G, there might be some coordination and some specific national action, but generally I think it's going to be much more diffuse. What I would watch is the private sector, particularly in the tech sector, because I think the nature of risk assessment in the tech sector and the private sector is changing, and in many ways I think they will lead governments in terms of how we do risk management in responding to China. Many years ago, the United States went to what's called global sourcing. So if there's a war, essentially, we go around the world and we collect up the forces we need and we send them there. So what this means is we can fight one war, but we really can't fight and deter in two places at once. So that creates a problem if you have in this natural tension between Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. But this gets to a really important point when I talked before about security assistance. I think one of the lessons from Ukraine that people in the middle have to learn is you have to demonstrate some capacity for self-defense and deterrence, because what you have to do is demonstrate that you can hold on and not get overrun in a day to give the rest of the world time to say, oh, okay, maybe we'll come and help you. So I think Taiwan's probably learned the lesson in this, that Taiwan has to be able to fight and hold ground for a period until everybody else decides whether they're going to jump in or not. And I just want to comment on Martin's point real quick, because I completely agree with that. But I think what's really, really important is I don't think thinking as in evolving strategic partnerships that we should think in terms of static or linear terms, because we've already seen an enormous amount of dynamism. So for example, in Central Europe, China has really lost tremendous ground. I mean, they've really almost backed out completely. In the Middle East, they're just kind of sitting on the sidelines. And what the Chinese do is they're very smart. They flow to where the opportunity are. So for example, we're seeing them really ramp up in Latin America. They're continuing to dominate in Asia. I think we're going to see interesting challenges to their influence in Southeast Asia. So I don't think you look at it as this kind of two ball clubs with two sides. There's an ongoing flux in this, and the Chinese are smart about flowing, and they're also smart about coming back. The Chinese will do something and it won't work. It doesn't mean, oh, they give up and they're gone forever. They'll regroup, rethink, and come back in a different form. For example, we've seen that with the Confucius Institutes in the United States, where there was a huge revulsion in that. They've largely, they've significantly downgraded. But the Chinese are creating new structures to kind of come back and penetrate American universities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I give the floor again to our speaker to close with the remarks.
Thank you. And for three questions, I'll try to, in this order, answer Professor Nodia's question first, student second, and Carl Gertman finally. Your question is about Russia and China, whether the ideological alignment. Yes. Not only just about the common interest that against the United States, anti-America sort of alliance. It is true, China and Russia, including China and Soviet Union, other than previous period of time, don't trust each other. They still don't trust each other. However, just look at President Xi Jinping, how many times he has met with President Putin in the last 10 years. 30 sometimes? Recently, birthday message. That's quite a close relationship. Not to mention the geopolitically, what they announced, no top limit cooperation. But ideologically, here it is. You mentioned Putin was profoundly a right-wing regime. China too. Particularly if you look at since 2015, I mean, I already mentioned the word fascism. What the Chinese ideological apparatus has been consistently constructing that framework with Chinese people? Three things: nationalism, including traditional culture, this and that. That's not traditional communism. Right? Second, great nation chauvinism. And give the Chinese people, those who are in the bottom, some sense of pride and dignity to identify. Of course, the traditional culture too. Third one, that's how the Chinese Communist Party's ideological machine describing the world. Social Darwinism, the law of the jungle. There's no rule, there's no right and wrong. Whoever has the power has to say and has the right to rule. This is explicit in the Chinese language all the time. And that, to me, profoundly a right-wing party state. And they align with Putin. Another thing, let me just say this. Yesterday we talked about Ukraine. I really want to talk about Ukraine. By the way, this is a national soccer team of New Jersey, of Ukraine. I see another thing yesterday we didn't mention. just from my personal perspective. What I call is called aging dictator problem. Not only a dictator that couldn't hear anything else that he doesn't want to hear, and it stays so long out of touch, but also he gets aged. He's aging. He's thinking about his legacy, and that's all he cares. I have personal experience of that. Mao in his late years. That's what he did. He makes most absurd, talking about absurdity, and crazy mistakes. I don't care about for himself, but for Chinese people. He ruined the country. He ruined people's lives, everyone, including all his comrades with him. And creating disasters, spectacular failures. And if those dictators had nuclear heads, warhead, think about it. Xi Jinping is not exactly an aging dictator, but he is an insecure dictator. That's another problem. We'll come back with this. Actually, I'll come to the student. Thanks for your question about asking me if I can respond what international society should do, what the United States should do, I guess, when China taking on Taiwan. Involved militarily, let me just say that. The reason is insecure dictator problem. When President Xi Jinping is very insecure, he's not Mao, he doesn't have that kind of charisma and the overpower to the rest of Chinese society. He has a repressive machine. He has political enemies. Those ones right now all are yes men under him, around him. But that's his potential biggest enemy. He's insecure, he needs justification, and he'll do something crazy and external to shift the target. And that's Taiwan.
Interesting.
And let's just say this. For dictators, they are not being persuaded by charm of liberty. But they can be persuaded by force. That's what I'm going to say about Ukraine, and I think that's what my response to Taiwan. Finally, maybe I'm ahead of my time, to Carl, your question. Yes, when I was 17, I was in high school, and it happened to be Mr. Xi Jinping at the time. He was 29, I believe, or 20, I don't know. I don't know him. I don't know his name. I met him this person because he lived upstairs. He was working in the secretary of a military chairman's office. Kind of came from the same background. Why went differently? Because I studied science, physics. Because in my undergraduate years, I was inspired particularly by what Western called him China's Sakharov, Professor Fang Lizhi, who was an astrophysicist, China's top astrophysicist, who also an advocate of human rights in Chinese society at the time, in the 1980s, inspirational mentor. What Professor Fang Lizhi represent? Well, in a sense, me, that follow the path. Different than Xi Jinping, was two strands of Chinese modern history. One, what I call the traditional legalism, the ruler ruling the party, traditional, that's the Chinese tradition. But coming to the modern crisis, the last 200 years, when China was facing the Western domination of technology and military power, then there's a two school of thought, two movement. One is what I called using the traditional, again, Confucianism, legalism, as the instance, what we really do, but use Western technology and knowledge and science as a tool to help to maintain the political hierarchy. That's called 中学为体，西学为用. That's a one school. Open to the West, only take what's useful, and to help to maintain the political entity. Another school is called complete modernization. It's that, well, you can't really learn science and technology and banks and the railways and all of that, modern military, without learning Western values. Their software, their religion, their philosophy, their liberty, political, this and that, free press. So you got to learn the whole thing. And then there are even more radical group. That's not even enough. Let's learn from Marxism and Leninism and the Soviet Union. Let's just do it. Actually, you know what? The more radical group succeeded, more than the two other groups. But the more radical group, which is Chinese Communist Party, which is Mao, didn't really just succeeded by following the Marxism and Leninism. It was partially due geopolitically. Mao was a brilliant strategist, but he's also a peasant. The whole thing was based on peasant rebellion in China. That's back to the Chinese another tradition, okay? So one thing being, another school being buried, wiped out, which is, what about modernized Chinese society and civilization, the full deal? Not only economics, not only learn just for maintain the old political entity, but transform the entire society from the education to philosophy to everything else, what I call the political modernization of China. That school never really died. Study science, only part of it. Wants to be democracy as another form of modernization, has been always there, but always been suppressed. In the 1980s, it's more explicit. We remember in Tiananmen, the Chinese students were putting the goddess of democracy in the middle of Tiananmen Square. That is a symbol of political modernization. Chinese people, just like other people in the world, we also want a free speech. Nobody wants the government watch them 24 hours a day. They just didn't have a choice right now. Gave them a really option. They were just like us. That political modernization people, or in the Chinese Communist Party today's condescending and attacking, demonizing word called, these people called full westernization. They attack them as the enemy, the traitor of the country. But actually it's not. It happens in the coastal areas. It happens in Shanghai. Most people, it happens in the more part of China. These people still exist, and the potential is still there that China political modernity, liberal science, that hope continue to exist. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we are now closing our session, and I'd like to read our colleagues from this panel. I think we have raised questions, not really settled anything, but like in open debates. We'll have now a session in the garden, and I think I can interpret our feelings if I leave a final word of greetings to those who have organized this forum. This is the 30th edition, and particularly to our good friend, Professor Spada, who is the mentor of this initiative. So interesting for all of us. Thank you, and I'll leave the final word to our host. Thank you.
Yes, I would just like to say a very brief word. It's kind of a footnote and a tip. If you are interested in looking at another angle of Chinese culture, do visit an exhibition in Museu do Oriente in Lisbon on Chinese opera. You are going to find there a most amazing collection of costumes and masks and everything connected to these century-long tradition in China of Chinese opera, and I think it's worth the visit. So do extend the range of the connection with China, and thank you so much for being here and giving us your attention. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's very interesting to me, Chinese opera.